You're listening to A Mighty Fortress, celebrating 500 years of Lutheranism.
A mighty fortress it is our God, a trusty shield and weapon. He bounds us free from
Hello and welcome to A Mighty Fortress. I am your host, Knight Jake Zabel. Welcome to our final episode of 2017. We've come to the end of our celebrations of the 500th anniversary of Luther nailing the 95 Theses to the church door at Wittenberg. Next year we'll be looking at other major events to celebrate. The first and foremost one that affects most Australian Lutherans is the 180th anniversary of the Lutherans coming to Australia. In 1838, the Gosnell missionaries came to Queensland and settled at Moreton Bay to have a mission to the Aboriginals. Sadly, their mission failed without a single convert to Christianity. However, also in that year, you had the Dresden missionaries come down to South Australia to minister to the Aboriginals down there. And then you also had the voyage of Pastor Carvel and a group of old Lutherans who fled the Prussian Union Church and the persecutions they were facing in Prussia to come to Australia where they could preach true confessional Lutheranism without fear of persecution. Also, and this doesn't affect most of Australia, but next year is the 25th anniversary of the AELC. That's the Australian Evangelical Lutheran Church, of which I am currently a vicar. So our synod will be celebrating 25 years since we broke away from the Lutheran Church of Australia. Now, before I get onto the topic that I want to do for this final episode for the year, I just want to do a bit of housekeeping in regards to some of the stuff that's going on with the Mighty Fortress podcast and into the broader Order of Knight George. I don't only just do this podcast, but I run a website called the Order of Knight George, which you can find at www.knightgeorge.info. The Order of Knight George is designed of being an intersynodical and non-synodical collective of Australian confessional Lutherans who have the goal of spreading the gospel throughout Australia and promoting confessional Lutheranism within Australia. The website itself is set up as a resource hub for confessional Lutheran content. We've got podcasts, mainly just my A Mighty Fortress podcasts. We also have sermon audio from a collection of pastors from the AELC, the LCA, and even some independent pastors also. The website also has videos and theological articles written by pastors from the LCA, the AELC, the ELCR, and again some independent Lutherans. The goal of the Order of Knight George is to promote the true gospel and the true word of God and to promote confessional Lutheran teachings within Australia. And also we hope that those teachings can be spread to the wider world. And I want to do this by spreading confessional Lutheran resources. So that's why we have the podcast, the sermons, the articles, and the videos. But what I'm also looking at doing is having a publishing house. So the idea of this is the Order of Knight George Publishing House is to print and distribute Australian confessional Lutheran books. Now I have some of my own books and works that I'd like to print, but I've also got some works from an independent confessional Lutheran pastor who's given me permission to print some of his works. But I've also got a few books there that they've no longer got copyright on them, and so I'm going to look at printing them. These are mainly works from the old Evangelical Lutheran Church of Australia, also known as the ELCA, not to be confused with the current Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. But the old Australian ELCA was the confessional Lutheran church body in Australia before the union between the ELCA and the more liberal UELCA. That's the United Evangelical Lutheran Church in Australia. So I've got a couple works from the ELCA that are no longer under copyright that I'm going to look at printing. And this is going to be part of my Australian Confessional Lutheran Classics series. Or just Australian Lutheran Classics. So the idea of this publishing house is to print and distribute works by Australian confessional Lutherans, both pastors and lay people. Now if anybody's got some works that they'd like me to print or can give me permission to print their works, I would really appreciate that, as I want to get the resources out there. Now, if you go onto my website, you'll be able to find I've got a few works available already. You just go to the Order of Knight George website, which is www.knightgeorge.info, and you go to the tab that says Publications. Now, the thing is, the Order of Knight George is not a registered organisation, so we don't actually have an ABM, so I legally can't sell these works. But I'm also not aiming at selling these works. I'm wanting to print and distribute these resources for free. The only issue is that, I'm not that wealthy. I'm not a billionaire. I can't just print endless works and distribute them for free. That's why I'm asking people for donations. I'm asking people to help support the work of the Order of Knight George by donating to us. You can either donate to us by a bank transfer. Our details are on the Order of Knight George website under our Contacts tab. Or we've also got a Patreon account now if you'd like to give a more regular donation to the Order of Knight George. Or I've also trying to set up a PayPal function on the Order of Knight George website so that you can donate via that. Either way, that's 3 different options you can donate to the Order of Knight George. So I am asking for donations to help us with our work of distributing confessional Lutheran resources, particularly the books, because this publishing house or printing press, whatever you want to call it, is going to be the most pricey thing for us. If you go to the website, you'll notice that I've got dollar amounts under all the books on my website. Now, as I said, I'm giving these books away for free. I'm not actually selling them to you. However, I'm putting dollar amounts under each of the books to show you roughly how much it costs me to print that book. Now, these books aren't super fancy. They're not like high quality books that you might get from the Concordia Publishing House, but they are reasonable books. They won't just fall apart in your hand. They're reasonable quality. They may not be an excellent quality, but they are reasonable. And the main point of these books is not to make money, not to be super fancy like Concordia Publishing House. The idea is to distribute this Australian confessional Lutheran materials. And so I'm not aiming for something super fancy. I'm just aiming for something basic so that I can get that information out there. But I'm going to need money to do this. And so under each of the books on the website, I'm putting a dollar amount to show you roughly how much it costs me to print that book. Now, you don't have to give that exact amount when you donate. You can either give less or you can give more. I'm just letting you know that roughly this is how much it costs to print this book. For example, on my website, I've got a book there that I've written on the topic of suicide, and I've got under it $5, because that's roughly how much it's going to cost me to print that book, when I take into account the paper, the ink, the printing, the electricity, the manual labor, all of that. So roughly about $5 is how much it's going to cost me to print that book. So I'm asking people to please donate $5 if you want a copy of that book. Now, in addition, I'm going to ask people for donations to help cover the costs of postage. Again, I'm looking at printing and distributing these books for free, but I need donations to help with the cost of printing and postage. If you order books from the Order of Knight George, once I've posted them to you, I'll send you a confirmation email to let you know that I've posted them. In that email, I'll also give you the cost of postage that it cost me to send those books to you. Again, I'm doing this out of the goodness of my heart, and I'm just posting these books to you for free. However, I would ask that you donate to the Order of Knight George. I do ask that you donate some money to the Order of Knight George to help cover the cost for that postage. Now, this isn't some kind of money grab, and I don't want people to think that I'm just hitting you up for money. But the issue is that if I'm going to be printing and posting books out of my own pocket, I'm quickly going to run myself into debt. So I'm asking people to please help support the work of the Order of Knight George. Please help us print and post these confessional Lutheran works by donating money to the Order of Knight George. Because if people don't donate, then I can only do so much. I have to keep printing and distributing everything out of my own pocket. I'm going to run myself bankrupt soon. And so if I can't get donations, I'm going to have to just stop the work. And I haven't actually officially started the work because at the moment I'm still looking at getting all the equipment. There's a few books that I can print because they're much more basic, but to print bigger books with proper covers and stuff like that, I need a bit more equipment. And so again, if people could help donate to the Order of Knight George so that I could buy some of this better equipment, then the books themselves will be of better quality. So this isn't some kind of money grab. I'm not trying to hit people up for money, but I am asking people that if they could please donate to the Order of Knight George, I can do more work. And if you want some Australian confessional Lutheran resources, do look at helping support the Order of Knight George, because I do want to get these materials out to people. I just need some financial support to help me distribute these works. Just a few more housekeeping things before I go. Next year I've also got a YouTube series I'm starting called Bible Wars. It's a YouTube series where I'm going to make these little kind of cartoonish videos. They're about 5 to 10 minutes long, in which I go through the historical background and give biblical commentary regarding some of the wars in the Bible. And so in 2018 I'm going to start off this series by going through Absalom's rebellion against King David. So if you're interested in learning some history and some background to the wars mentioned in the Bible, do check out this series. It will be on YouTube on my channel called Knight Jake, and the series is called Bible Wars. Now, getting on with today's episode, I'm going to be talking about the topic of degrees of reward in heaven and degrees of reward in hell. Now, this is a biblical idea that some people promote, and the way it basically gets explained is that we all go to heaven if we believe in Jesus Christ. And we don't have to do any good works, but that our good works on earth will give us greater rewards in heaven. Now, I don't think this is biblical. I mean, just to understand this concept, I like to explain it as this. Everybody gets given $1 million, but a few people get $1,001 and a few people get $1,002. Is there really much of a difference? You've all got $1 million. And see, this is how people understand this idea of degrees in heaven. We all get to go to heaven. Some people will be slightly higher in heaven. Some people will be slightly lower in heaven. I don't think this is biblical, this concept. I mean, there's numerous verses that people try to give to support this idea, and I'm going to show you in this podcast some of the verses people give. One of the verses they use is like when it talks about in the Psalms that stars have different degrees of brightness, and therefore in heaven Christians will have different degrees of brightness. But that's not what that verse is talking about. That verse has got to do with God creating, and I don't think that's a good verse. Now, I don't like this doctrine. I think it's basically a form of prosperity gospel. It's also a bit of worksist. I know people who hold to this doctrine of degrees of punishment in hell and degrees of reward in heaven say that our works don't get us to heaven, faith gets us to heaven, but that they then go on to say that depending on what works you do in this life, depending on how much you suffer and are persecuted in this life and stuff like that, depends on how much you'll be rewarded in heaven. I don't know, it sounds a bit more like karma. Now I know what some people are thinking. They're thinking of things like, you reap what you sow. Therefore, if you reap good works, then you should sow the benefit of good work. If you sow bad works, you should reap the benefits of bad work. I don't think that's necessarily talking about, our spiritual life and the heavenly reality, that if I sow good works on earth, I'll get good rewards in heaven. And if I sow bad works on earth, I won't get as many rewards in heaven. See, I don't think Christianity works in this kind of karmic logic, that you only get rewards in heaven equal to how much good works you did on earth, or how much you suffered on earth. I don't think that's biblical. I'm going to propose a different view later in this episode. Firstly, I'll be going through all the verses I can think of that people use to support this idea. Now, this isn't an extensive list, and there's probably more verses out there, but I'm just going to give some of the basic ones. The first one I've got comes from Matthew chapter 5, verses 11 and 12. Where Jesus says, "Blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evils against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward in heaven is great, for so they persecuted the prophets who were before you." Now some people think that, if I get persecuted heaps in this life, then I'll get greater rewards in heaven. But I don't think that's right. What Jesus is saying is, Jesus isn't saying that the more you get persecuted in this life, the more reward you get in heaven. What he's saying is that those who are persecuted in this life for his sake are those that will go to heaven. Because those who are persecuted for Christ's sake are the Christians. These are the ones that have faith in Jesus. So they will get to go to heaven. So the next verse is Matthew 6:1-6. Beware of practicing your righteousness before other people in order to be seen by them, for then you will have no reward from your Father who is in heaven. Thus, when you give to the needy, sound no trumpet before you as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, that they may be praised by you. Truly I say to you, they have received their reward. But when you give to the needy, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be in secret, and your Father who sees it in secret will reward you. And when you pray, you must not be like the hypocrites, for they love to stand and pray in synagogues and at the street corners, that they may be seen by others. Truly I say to you, they have received their reward. But when you pray, go into your room and shut the door, and pray to your Father in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you. Some people have taken this to say that, if you don't do righteousness, you won't get any reward in heaven. But if you do righteous deeds, God will see you and reward you in heaven. And therefore, the more charitable deeds you do in secret, and the more times you pray in secret, you get greater rewards in heaven. However, that's a false understanding of this verse. See, we first need to know that Jesus says that if you go around practicing your righteousness like the Pharisees, then you will have no reward in heaven. See, that's actually a very serious thing. Not no reward like as, you have less reward in heaven, but actually no reward. You won't get to go to heaven. Because this is if you act like the Pharisees. If you're self-righteous and you walk around and you parade your good works around and you think that you're somehow saved by your good works, if you're so boastful and prideful and self-righteous and you think that you're so much better than everyone because you do these works of charity, you have no reward in heaven. Because you're not humble and you're not repentant. In fact, you stand in opposition to God. That's why you'll have no reward in heaven. See, you notice that Jesus says that the people who do this are hypocrites and they have already received their reward. What he's talking about is the fact that they have already received their reward in this life. Those who run around and do pious deeds and are self-righteous. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying pious deeds are a bad thing. In fact, Jesus and that tells us that we should live a good life. We should do good deeds. Like he tells us to go and be charitable. But what he's saying is be charitable in secret. Don't make a big deal out of it. Do good works out of love for the neighbor and love for God. Do not do good works so that others may see you and praise you and boast about you. Jesus says in other places that we should do our good works so that our light may shine to the world. We should do good works to bring glory to God. We should do good works for the sake of our neighbor. We should not be doing good works in order to please the people around us, in order to make us look like we're so holy and righteous. See, this is the error of all those social justice warrior Christians who make a big deal out of, oh, look at me, I'm tolerant of gays. I accept transgender people. I look after all the minorities. Thing is, they're Pharisees. They're condemning those who don't tolerate gays, who don't look after the minorities, but they're boasting in their own good works. We should not boast in our good works, but we should boast in Jesus Christ and his work on the cross. Because it's not our good works that save us, but it is Jesus who saves us. If you think your good works have saved you, you will not have reward in heaven. Instead, you will receive your reward here on earth. But if you come to God in faith and humility, you're repentant, you trust in Jesus, and that you do your good works as an outward expression of your faith, that your good works are a reaction to the love that God first showed you, that you love your neighbor, and you do so because you want to bring glory to God and you want to care for your neighbor, and not to bring glory to yourself, then you will have a reward in heaven. Because you are faithful, you are a believing Christian, and you will be saved. The next verse follows in this same vein, where in Matthew 6:16-20 says, And when you fast, do not look gloomy like the hypocrites, for they disfigure their faces when they are fasting, so that others may see them. Truly I say to you, they have received their reward. But when you fast, anoint your head and wash your face, that your fasting may not be seen by others, but that your Father who is in secret and your Father who sees in secret will reward you. Do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal, but lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven where neither moth nor rust destroys and when thieves cannot break in and steal. See, this follows the same vein where people think, but I gotta build up rewards in heaven. Shouldn't store up rewards on earth. Instead, I should be storing up all my treasures in heaven. So when I get to heaven, I'll have great heavenly treasures. Again, that's not what this text is talking about. The context of this text is don't be prideful. Don't use good works as some way to prove that you're going to heaven. Don't be a legalist. Don't trust in salvation by good works. If you do, you have already received your reward on earth and you will not receive a reward in heaven. But if you humble yourself before God, if you live in faith and that your good works are an expression of faith, then you will have reward in heaven. Do not try to build up rewards for yourself on earth through your good works, but instead build up rewards for yourself in heaven. And you do that by having faith in Jesus. That's what we should be doing. The next verse is one that comes from Matthew 16:27, where Jesus says, "For the Son of Man is going to come with his angels in the glory of his Father, and he will repay each according to what he has done." Now, before I respond to that, I've just got another verse that's similar to that I want us to talk about as well, where Paul says in Romans 2:5 and 6, "But because of your hard and impenitent hearts you are storing up for yourself wrath on the day of wrath, when God's righteous judgment will be revealed. He will render to each according to his works." Now, people believe that this means that God will render to us according to our works. Those who have done good will receive great blessings in heaven, and those who have done bad will receive terrible sufferings in hell. And those who have lived a better life receive greater reward in heaven. Now, this is just not biblical. For example, James says, if you keep the whole law of God but break it in just one spot, then you're guilty of breaking the whole law. James says if you've committed a single sin, then you're guilty as if you've broken all of God's law. So when God comes to punish sinners, he's not going to make a distinction between this guy's worse than that guy. Because in God's eyes, all sinners are horrible. All sinners have broken his law and all sinners are deserving of punishment in hell for eternity. And as for us Christians, well, none of our good works can please God. Our good works are just filthy rags before God, said Isaiah. And as Hebrews says, without faith it is impossible to please God. And as Paul said in Romans, that which does not proceed from faith is sin. Any good works that you do that do not come from faith are sin. So all those good works that you do in this life before God mean nothing unless they have faith. And when you come to God and you do good works in faith, it is not the works that please God, but the faith behind them. Sure, God is pleased when we keep his law, but it is that we do those works in faith. That we do them not for our own selfish, greedy desires, but that we do them to bring glory to him, and we do them out of love for our neighbour. That is what pleases God. And so when God comes to judge each according to their works, he's not judging us based on who did more works than someone else. Instead, he's coming to judge those who have done their good works with faith and those who have done their good works without faith. And we see this if you turn to Matthew 25 and you look at the parable of the sheep and the goats. Jesus comes to the sheep and he says, you can come into heaven for you did these good works. And he says to the goats, you're going to hell because you didn't do these works. Now he's not saying we're saved by works, but these works are evidence of those who have faith. See, goats are goats and sheep are sheep. And those who are sheep will display their sheepness through their works, whereas those who are goats will show their goatness through their wickedness. We'll be able to see who is righteous and who is unrighteous based on their works. Those who do their works without faith, who do their works out of greed and selfishness, they are the goats. Whereas those who do their works out of faith, out of love for God and love for neighbour, these will receive salvation. So when God comes to judge each according to their works, he's not judging us based specifically on the works. He's judging us on whether our works are done in faith or without faith. And we know this because Paul tells us in Romans and Galatians and Ephesians that we are saved by grace alone, through faith alone, apart from the works of the law. Our works don't save us. Instead, our works are evidence of our faith. When God judges us based on our works, He's not looking at the works themselves, but at the faith behind them. Those works done in selfishness and greed do not flow from faith. And those who do these works do not have faith and will not come to heaven. But those works that are done in glory to God and for love of neighbour, these works flow from faith, and they are evidence of faith, so that those who have these works are those who have done these works in faith. And it is that faith that saves us. This is the context of these verses when God says that He will judge each of us according to our work. He is not giving some people a greater reward in heaven or a greater punishment in hell because of the works that they did. See, another verse is Matthew 25, which is the parable of the talents, where the master leaves his men with the talents, and he gives 10 talents to one person, 2 talents to another, and they get back 100% profit. He says, "Well done, you've been faithful with little, therefore I'm going to put you in charge of much." And you have this equivalent of this in Luke's Gospel, chapter 19, where you have the parable of the 10 minas, where he gives 10 minas to one person. He says, "Lord, I have got another 10 for you." And he says, "Well done, I'm going to put you in charge of 10 cities." And another man comes and says, "Lord, you gave me 5 minas. Behold, I've got another 5 for you." And he says, "Well done, I'm going to put you in charge of 5 cities." Now some people take that to say, see, one person got put in charge of 10 cities while one person got charge of 5 cities. Therefore, one person has a greater reward than the other. However, they're missing the fact that these people didn't do different shares of work. In fact, one was given 10 and he got back 10. One was given 5 and he got back 5. They got back the equal amount that they were given. These 2 servants did the exact same amount of work. They got back exactly 100% each. Therefore, when their master put them in charge of different cities, he wasn't giving one more cities because he did a better work, for the work that had been done by these servants was equal. Instead, he was giving them a reward equal to the work that they had done. And the work that they had done was based on the work that was entrusted to them. He who had received 10 had got back 10, and therefore he was given 10 cities. He who was given 5 received back 5, and therefore he was given 5 cities. See, this is grace here. They were given these minas out of grace, and their reward is equal to the grace that was given to them. And see, the important part of this parable is not so much on the fact that these servants did this work and got this reward. The point of this story is that there was a servant who was given either 1 talent in Matthew or 1 mina in Luke, and he didn't do what he was meant to do with that. He buried it. He hid it away. He didn't actually do the work that God had entrusted him with. He wasn't a faithful servant. It's always important to note that in this story, when the master talks to the first 2 servants, he calls them faithful, whereas when he talks to the other servant, he calls him wicked. This is not about the work that was done, but about the faith that was behind the works. The top servants who went and invested the money, they did so in faith. They did their good works in faith that their master would look after them and forgive them, and that their master had entrusted them with this work. Whereas the last servant was lazy and fearful. He saw his master as a judge, and he refused to do the work that was entrusted to him. He was a lazy and wicked servant who didn't have faith. That's the importance of these texts. They're not about greater reward in heaven or hell. They're about people doing work out of faith. Now, as I've shown, these verses that are often put forth by people to support this view of degrees of reward and degrees of punishment do not actually talk about greater degrees of reward in heaven or greater degrees of punishment in hell. Instead, they're merely talking about doing works in faith, and that those who do not do good works out of faith will go to hell with no reward, whereas those who do good works in faith will have a great reward. Or in the case of Matthew 5, 11 and 12, those who suffer for Christ's sake will receive a reward in heaven. This is not saying that those who have an easier life as a Christian will have less reward, and that those who have suffer more persecution will have a greater reward, but that we will all receive a great reward in heaven because we suffer for the sake of Christ. Those who suffer for Christ's namesake are Christians. They are his people. They are those who have been redeemed. And Christ is trying to comfort them by saying, don't worry. Do not fear those who can harm only your body but can't touch your soul. Instead, fear God, who is the only one who has power over your soul. He is the one who will judge your soul and decide whether it goes to heaven or hell. Fear him alone. Jesus is saying, do not be disheartened by the suffering you face in this world. Instead, be gladdened and rejoice, for even though you suffer in this life for his name's sake, you will be rewarded in heaven for his name's sake. You suffer in this life because you bear the name of Christ. Because the world hated him, so too it will hate all his followers. But because you bear his name, you will receive great reward in heaven. That's what this text is talking about. An important verse to always keep in mind when we are talking about the fact of this degrees of reward in heaven is Matthew chapter 20 and the labourers in the vineyard. If you remember in this story, some workers came at the beginning of the day, some came in the middle of the day, some came in the afternoon, some came only an hour before closing. All these people did different degrees of work. Some worked all day, some only worked 1 hour. And yet at the end of the day, all of them actually received the same reward. All of them all got 1 denarius. And this is how God works. It doesn't matter when you became a Christian. And it doesn't matter how many good works you do in this life. The fact is that Christ gives an equal share to everyone. For we all get to go and live with him in eternity in heaven. There's not some different rankings in heaven where I'm somehow greater than somebody else. But instead, we all go to heaven. We all receive the same reward. Every one of us gets $1 million. It's not like I get $1 million and that person gets $1,000,001 and that other person gets $1,000,005. No, we all get the $1 million. We all get the exact same reward. Now, just to note, the $1 million is a metaphor. That's not what you get in heaven. You get much greater riches when you get to go to heaven. You get eternal life with God where there's no pain and no suffering. Now, however, there is one thing I'd like to say on this concept of degrees of reward and degrees of suffering. And it's how I would like to answer that to an extent there is degrees of reward and degrees of suffering. But it's not the way that we first think of it. See, in Luke's Gospel, chapter 7, verse 47, Jesus says that this adulterous woman who is kissing his feet and cleaning his feet with her tears and her hair, she loved much because she had been forgiven much. But he who that is forgiven little loves little. Jesus says that those of us who have received the forgiveness for a lot of sins will love a lot. But those of us who have received forgiveness for only a few sins will love little. And see, this does teach us that there is somewhat of a degree of reward and, in a sense, degree of punishment. And it's not that someone who did better works in this life or suffered more in this life will get $1,000,001, whereas somebody who didn't will only get $1 million. So he's not saying that if we suffer more in this life or if we do more good works in this life that we'll somehow receive a greater reward in heaven. We all receive the cleansing of sin. We all have our sins removed. However, some of us have more sins than others. So therefore we have more removed and we have more to be thankful for. This is what I say when we receive greater reward in heaven. See, if we use the analogy of getting $1 million, see, all Christians are in debt to God. We all owe God a debt. We owe God for the sins that we have committed. But Jesus died and paid off our debt. Every one of us gets a clean debt. But if one person owed $100 to God, whereas another person owed $1,000 to God, and both of them have their sins removed, then one person has had $100 removed, whereas one person has had $1,000 removed. Therefore, the person who received the forgiveness of $1,000 technically got a greater reward. Yes, in heaven, both of them will have an equal grounding. But on earth, one of them was lower than the other. So when they got to heaven, they actually received a greater reward. And this works also with suffering. If you're a Christian who lives in a first world country where there's no persecution versus a Christian who lives in a Middle Eastern country where they to fear going to church, that if they go to church they could be blown up or shot or have their heads chopped off, and that they die a martyr whereas you die peacefully in your sleep, both of you will get an equal reward in heaven, but one of you will appreciate it more because one of you had a worse life on earth. This is what we talk about with the degrees of reward in heaven. Not that some person in heaven will have a better life in heaven, but that there are people who have had a worse life on earth, and so when they get to heaven, they will appreciate it more. For them, it will be a greater gift bestowed upon them than it was to someone who had an easier life. And the reverse happens for those who go to hell. If you're some kind of a sinner that lives on the street and you steal from people, you're a pickpocketer, versus some multi-millionaire sinner that backstabs everybody and walks over everybody and idolizes money, when you both die, one of you is going to lose more than the other. When you both go to hell, you're both going to be suffering for eternity. But one of you didn't have any money in this life, and one of you was a multi-millionaire. So one of you is losing more when you go to hell. And so this is a correct understanding of degrees of reward in heaven and degrees of punishment in hell. There are not people in heaven who have a greater life in heaven than somebody else. The thing is that everybody in heaven will have the best life imaginable. The difference is some people on earth have had it easier than others, and so when they get to heaven, it will be a greater blessing that is bestowed upon them because of the pain and the suffering they felt in this life. Those who are poor in this life, those who are sick, those who suffer in this life will find it a much greater reward when they get to heaven than somebody who was a multi-millionaire Christian in this life that never had any persecution, was well loved by everybody, and had no struggles in their life. Both of you get the same reward in heaven, but one of you appreciates it much more than the other. Just as those of us who have had less sins forgiven will love God less than those who have had more sins forgiven. So this is the true biblical understanding of degrees of reward in heaven. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of A Mighty Fortress, and I hope you've enjoyed this last year of episodes produced by A Mighty Fortress. I hope you can join us next year for a collection of new episodes produced by A Mighty Fortress. I've been your host, Jake Zabel. Goodbye, God bless, and have a happy new year.